Hello and welcome to the latest Science of Sport podcast. I'm your host Matt Solomon, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Louise Wood. So Louise started her career in sport rehab, and she also went on to do a master's degree in strength and conditioning. Since then, she's worked for the NHS, she's worked in professional rugby, and she's currently working with QPR Women's football team. And she's here today to discuss how you can improve your recovery from bone breaks. So Louise, welcome to the Science of Sport podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So can you give us a quick introduction as to who you are and what you've been up to until now?
I am Louise. I have a bachelor's in sports rehab, a master's in strength and conditioning. I've worked for the NHS, started out in respiratory, moved on to geriatric medicine, working with falls patients. I also started as a casual at QPR, been there 3 seasons now, so I've worked my way up to the PDP and the women's team. And I've just finished a 3-month stint at the London Broncos working as a senior therapist and strength and conditioning coach.
Nice. So that's a busy schedule on a weekly basis. And we're going to discuss bone injuries today. So why the specific interest in bone injuries?
So I just think the skeletal system is quite interesting. I think a lot of time we think of it as like this kind of hard, dead, dry structure, but it's actually like a metabolically active, interesting thing that adapts to various different stressors, and it's not as boring as people think it is.
So we're going to obviously touch on that. Hopefully, it's more interesting than people think it is now. So when we're talking about bone injuries, why are they important? So, like, before we get onto all of what happens and stuff, but why is that an important thing to be considered?
A bone injury can be quite catastrophic to an athlete, obviously depending on the severity of it. Even things like minor stress fractures and things like that can definitely inhibit performance. So it's definitely something that you need to kind of know about, be aware of, and know how to treat and what to do with.
And where do these occur in terms of sports? Because I'm thinking about table tennis. Not many bone injuries. I'm thinking rugby and American football. I can see some really obvious mechanisms of injury there. So what kind of sports are we talking about?
So bone injuries are generally a result of kind of like a high impact trauma, like a high energy force hitting you. So things like your contact sports, like you said, rugby, NFL, snowboarding, skiing, things like that, anything where you're at risk of falling, combat sports as well, your boxing, your martial arts, all things like that.
And I'm rudely interrupting to make sure you're up to date and aware of the Science of Sport Coach Academy. The Coach Academy is an overgrowing library of sports science courses which are broken down into bite-sized chunks. So if you're enjoying today's podcast and you want to get your hands on some more great sports science information, all you have to do is hit the link in the show notes. You can get in there completely for free for the next 7 days. You can hit that link in just a few minutes' time. Excellent. And yeah, obviously you just mentioned stress fractures, which is different to other types. So can you walk us through then the different types of bone injuries that could occur? I mean, you've got loads of different sports you've just named, and I work with a couple of them, have worked with a couple of them. I'm like, yeah, I've seen that. So can you talk us through what type of injuries might occur?
So you can obviously get stress fractures, which are obviously repeated micro trauma. You tend to see them a lot in things like long distance runners or people who are new to running who are not sort of conditioned to, go through high mileage on hard surfaces. So they can be quite difficult to detect. And also long distance runners are always notoriously difficult to manage as well. But then your big kind of complete fractures will come from tackles, awkward landings, like crashing into solid objects, things like that. And then in terms of types of fractures you can get, we've already kind of briefly touched on stress fractures, which are those repeated micro traumas that just cause a little bit of damage to the sort of surface of the bone. And then there are like hundreds of different classifications of bone injury, dependent on the mechanism and the location of the injury. Just to give you an idea of how many different types there are 86 different classifications of facial fracture. But don't worry, I'm not going to go through them all. I'll just go through the main ones that you get in sport.
You could, but I might switch off.
Nobody else will find it interesting apart from me, so we'll just do the big ones. So you can get like an avulsion fracture, which is where a tendon pulls off the bone and takes a little bit of the bone with it. You tend to see that more in sort of younger athletes, especially in their rapid growth spurts, and also because their skeleton's not completely ossified, so it's a little bit easier for them to pull a bit of bone off. You can also get complete fractures of the bone where you just get a straight line through the middle, mid-shaft type fractures, like tib, fib, things like that. And then there's kind of oblique fractures where they go sort of at an angle, segmented breaks where you get like one or more breaks in one bone. You can also get linear fractures, which run sort of horizontally rather than vertically. Spiral fractures, again, they tend to occur in younger athletes, generally as a twisting kind of injury. And then you can get compound fractures, which is where the bone completely comes out of the skin, which is kind of serious.
Doesn't sound great. And obviously there's a lot of different types of fractures, and the severity is going to depend on how long it takes to heal. But what kind of time frames are we looking at? Because I mean, a stress fracture, it sounds like there's not too much going on. It just needs a little bit of time to get back to normal. And obviously, if your bone's sticking out of your leg, you've probably got some bigger rehab issues going on there.
Yeah.
So can you walk us through like the time frame for some different
I mean,
injuries?
the general going rate for a bone injury is about 6 to 8 weeks. That's for anything that's sort of non-complex, non-surgical. But it can take months for a bone to fully heal, obviously depending on the severity. But with bone injuries, we tend to kind of start load bearing them as soon as they're kind of structurally able to withstand it. But yeah, the full process can take months, sometimes years, depending on the severity.
And what's kind of physiology of that? Because you've obviously you've got to kind of make more tissue and patch that all up, right? So can you walk us through the process of how that works?
So again, it's quite a complicated process, but I'll just kind of give you the kind of basic facts of it. So there's 4 main phases to the healing of a complete fracture. So the first one is the hematoma phase, and the inflammation. So when you break a bone, there tends to be a lot of bleeding around it because it's basically just full of tiny little canals that are full of vascular structures. So you get a lot of bleeding, and then a hematoma will form around the break, which will offer a little bit of kind of scaffold in the malunion of the bone. And then the inflammation process will begin. So the inflammatory chemicals will start to recruit stem cells to the site, and then they will kind of begin sort of the initial stages of healing. And then the second phase is a soft callus formation. So that's where you get the cells starting to differentiate into chondroblasts, which is cartilage, and then osteoblasts, which are bone cells. And they start to form a soft callus around the bone, which is predominantly made of fibrocartilage, it's the same stuff your ears are made out of. And then they start to build a matrix in the gap, and then granulation of new tissues starts to bring like rich blood vessels, connective tissue, and then sort of stabilizes around the injury. So that phase takes a few weeks, and then the next phase is where you get the hard callus to form. So that's when you get like your osteoblasts, which are your bone cells. They start invading the soft callus, laying down new bone tissues and start to give more structural stability. So that stage can take a few months. Obviously, while this is all going on, the bone is kind of getting a bit stronger and you can start to load it a little bit, so you don't have to wait months before you can start walking again or anything like that. And then the final stage is the remodeling. So that's where the new bone cells start to reshape the bone. All the old structures go out, so the soft callus starts to break down, your macrophages, neutrophils and all that come and break down all that. And then it reshapes, you get that mechanical and structurally sound part of bone to grow. And then, because it's laying down new bone, basically starting from scratch, it can take quite a long time. I mean, in some stages, it can take up to several years to put new bone down. And again, depending on how long it takes to adapt to the mechanical demands of each athlete.
And obviously that's a very complex and in-depth process. Surely there are ways to accelerate that, right? Like, it sounds like there's a lot of things going on, and there are surely there are ways that you can be like, oh, well, maybe we can get that to speed up a little bit, or we can move through this process a little bit quicker. Are there any ways that
Yeah,
that can
absolutely.
happen?
I mean, one of the most important things when you're talking about a bone injury, well, with most injuries really, is nutrition. So particularly protein and vitamin C. So about 50% of your bone tissue is made up of protein. So I think the research suggests you eat 1.5 grams of protein per kilo of body weight to try and get that sort of protein into your system. And then vitamin C intake, which helps to build sort of collagen, which is really important around bone healing. You also need a good blood flow, so you can do some light exercise, obviously depending on where your injury is. So if it's a leg, try and stay off feet, a bit of off feet conditioning. If it's an arm, you can do some bike work, that get the blood pumping, bring that blood supply in, get everything moving a lot better. Protection of the injury is very important. Make sure you're not sort of disrupting that process as much as possible. And then avoid things like alcohol, smoking, drugs, all that sort of thing. And then another thing that's recommended is a sort of paracetamol for pain, just to kind of make sure that you're able to move around and still do your day-to-day activities and get that sort of blood flow and oxygen and everything flowing to the injury.
Excellent. Obviously, I think a lot of athletes will probably be doing a lot of those things anyway. So I think a lot of people are probably already doing a lot of the good things. But it's good to know that the recommendations for protein, for example, stay pretty high whilst you're
definitely.
injured in that sense. Like that's an interesting little fact that, next to it. But when you bring this all together, I'm interested to hear how this works in real life, right? So how do you go about rehabbing from a bone injury? You can take any fracture or whatever you want, but I'm interested to go through that process and see how that looks.
So obviously, like with most injuries, every case is sort of different. So your number one priority would be protection of the injury. So you've got to make sure you're stabilising the injury, so the healing can go through the motions and do its thing. The skeletal system is much cleverer than all of us. So the bone will heal itself. So in terms of rehab, you don't have to do much for the bone. It's all the things that kind of go with being offloaded and immobilized for a long period of time. So you're going to be working on things like your hypertrophy, so you're going to lose a lot of your muscle mass when you're not moving, you're not weight bearing. Your joint mobility, so you're going to need to kind of stay on top of things like that. You're also going to lose strength, you're going to lose fitness. I mean, you can do all the off-field conditioning in the world, but it doesn't recreate sort of, on-field fitness. So it's all those things that you need to manage. So that's kind of where you'd go, and it would depend obviously on your athlete, your sport, like where their deficits are, and how you kind of program your rehab around that.
And can you walk us through how you might do that with? We can make someone up if you want, but anyone that you've previously worked with, or we can make up a fictive person. What might that look like in terms of a training session, for example?
So it depends on what stage you are. So if you're in sort of like an acute phase, you can do things like complex for some muscle stimulation, try and get that sort of muscle activity going, try and stave off the atrophy as much as possible. You can, depending on if they're in a solid cast or a boot, you can try and maybe take them out of the boot, get them sort of moving the joints around the fracture site. So, if it's say for example, a tibial fracture, you can do some knee range of motion, you can maybe do some ankle mobility, things like that, just nothing too strenuous, as much as they can manage. Then obviously you need to kind of work around sort of the injury itself. So you kind of go above the site of the fracture. So you'd strengthen like hip, quads, hamstrings, all that sort of thing. And then obviously as they're progressing through their rehab, you can then start loading them more. You can also use lots of modalities like BFR for hypertrophy. You can use sort of hydrotherapy to work on their sort of gait mechanics, get them in the pool, get them walking. If you've got access to an Alter G, you can do some sort of anti-gravity treadmill stuff for all that gait re-education as well. You also need to work on things like proprioception, so you would incorporate that into their rehab, and things like joint mobility, so you can do manual mobility if they're still in really early stage. Once they start progressing, obviously then you need to get that range of motion back at the joint, so lots of mobility exercises, going through their ranges of motion, trying to kind of get that back to their baseline so they're able to participate in their sports again.
Absolutely excellent. So, Louise, massive thanks for your time and effort today. It's been a pleasure talking. Where can people find some more about you and what
So
you're up
I'm
to?
on LinkedIn. You can find me on LinkedIn. I think the link will be in the show notes. I'm also on Instagram. I am LNW_performance. So there's some stuff on there about what I'm up to.
Perfect. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank
And
you.
look forward
Thank
to
you for
speaking
having
again
me.
soon.
Thank you.
And that's it. Once again, a massive thanks to Louise for all of her hard work on today's podcast. I really enjoyed it. I hope you did at home too. Before you leave, I want to point you in the direction of the Science of Sport Coach Academy. The Coach Academy is an overgrowing library of sports science courses which are broken down in bite-sized chunks. So if you enjoyed today's podcast and you want to get your hands on some more great sports science information, all you have to do is hit the link and you get in there completely for free for the next 7 days. What's more, every time you complete one of the courses, you'll get a certificate of completion which will prove your ongoing education. So hit that link in just a few minutes' time. And of course, if you have enjoyed today's podcast, it'd be fantastic if you could recommend it to a coach, a colleague, an athlete, or a friend. It means that we can keep bringing you the best possible guests and the best possible content. And that's it. Once again, a massive thanks from me. I'm Matt Solomon of Science of Sport, and I'll speak to you next week.